Great. Thank you, Marina. Appreciate it. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for showing up. Nice crowd. Thank you very much. I'm going to quickly introduce the panel here and then tell you why we're here and then go straight to the topic. So, start with myself. I'm Jeff Koinange, CNN's Africa correspondent based in Johannesburg. Been there for the last couple of years, and before that in Nigeria, and we'll get to that in a moment. And on the panel with me tonight, Sophie Ly Sow from Senegal, a journalist and promoter of free press in Africa. Right next to her is Arlindo Lopes from Mozambique, Secretary General, Southern African Broadcasting Association. We have Azubuike Ishiekwene, Nigerian, Executive Director of Publications at Punch Newspapers in Nigeria. And right next to me is Lizeka, South African, Managing Editor of City Press in South Africa. Real quick, we are here, the four of us and three others who are in the audience right here, as judges for what's known as the CNN Multichoice African Journalist of the Year Awards. This is an award that CNN and Multichoice give to African journalists. We recognize and promote journalism on the African continent by African-owned media houses, newspapers, radio stations, the works, everything that's based in Africa. People who go out telling the African story, those are the people that we judge. And in fact, this year we've had an amazing amount of entries, more than 1,600. And we're spending the whole week in London, all of us, judging these entries, and we'll have a winner by the end of this week. And the event itself will be in Cape Town, South Africa, actually, in July. So it's a very busy week for us judges, and a great opportunity for us to talk about our topic tonight, which is uncovering the Africa underreported by Western media. Now, let me just throw a couple of statistics at you real quick. And these are World Bank figures, by the way, I have in front of me. Anyone want to guess which African country had the highest GDP rate last year? Go on, sir. Botswana. Okay, who else? It's not Botswana. Sir. Good answer, but it's not it. Anyone else? No, Azu, not you. Lady in the bag. Good try. Somebody else. Sir in the bag. Gabon? Sir, no. Lady right in the bag. Angola. When's the last time you ever heard of a story out of Angola? Right? Angola's growth rate last year, 17.6%. The fastest growing economy on the planet. We'll get more to Angola in a moment. Country with the least growth rate last year. Easy one. And yet, we heard how many stories about Zimbabwe in the last year, last 6 months? Every other day there's a story about Zimbabwe. Why? Because it's people dying of what? Why? Because it's a negative story? Because it's bad? Yeah. And why didn't you hear about Angola?
Because we heard of Angola when it was negative.
During the war.
Yeah. And that's the point. Why don't we promote the positive? Why don't we? Lizeka, real quick. South Africa, great economy. The democracy is taking shape. Lots of stories about crime in South Africa. What are the underreported stories or unreported stories in South Africa? What don't you hear about? What doesn't the audience hear about?
Well, the economic story, for a start, I don't think many people get a lot of that story. As far as South Africa is concerned, I think everyone knows about the Zuma story. Everyone knows about the AIDS story, and it's the same thing, you know. It's the negative. Maybe it's what we live on, the negative. But the positive, the economy that's growing in excess of 5% by official figures. But if you look at VAT, you know, receipts and everything, actually South Africa is maybe growing at about 7 to 8%.
And yet,
growth.
Good.
But that's not what you hear.
Correct. What you hear about is AIDS, bad governments, corruption, or as a good friend of mine likes to call it, the 4Ds: death, disease, despair, and desperation. That's all we hear about all the time. Talking about good governance, there are so many burgeoning democracies on the continent, from Botswana to Ghana to Tanzania to Mozambique. Albeit once in a while, you know, there's a setback, like the just recently concluded Nigerian elections, which were described, or some of the foreign observers call them a charade, for lack of a better word. Azu, you work for the Punch newspaper, the largest leading daily in Nigeria. Your thoughts? You were there during the elections. How were they covered? Was it as bad as we heard they were?
Well, first, before I comment on the elections, just a quick, thought on the economy, the state of the economy. In 1999, when the Obasanjo administration, the civilian administration, came to power, the subscriber base for telephone, mobile telephone, was, for a population about 140, 150 million, it was about 4 million. But right now, it's about 38 going to 40 million, with MTN, Celtel, and a whole lot of telecommunication company doing good business in Nigeria. But let me take the question about the elections which you asked. There were challenges about the elections, all right, but we should put these challenges in a context. We must recall that until the last elections were held, until the last elections were held, we had not had any civilian-to-civilian transition. This government, which had the last elections, in spite of all the challenges and difficulties, was the longest-running civilian government since independence. So, I mean, these were the challenges that we had to face. And when people report about the situation, about the challenges that we faced, of course, I do not undermine the challenges, but people report it out of the context under which these elections were held.
But bottom line, they were bad. They were bad.
They were not as bad as they look, if you understand the context.
I wish I was there. I would have loved to be there, but...
You're always welcome, John.
Okay, let's move over to Mozambique. Arlindo, your country, in a horrific 15-year civil war for many years, came out of it, one administration after another. It seems like you have a 5-year presidency that's renewable. Yeah. So, and you guys are not doing too badly, huh? I mean, it's relative, but Mozambique isn't doing too badly.
That's right, and thank you for asking that question. But let me just, before talking about the specific problem regarding Mozambique, let me just say that I have the impression that, yes, first of all, in general, the coverage of African issues is a little bit improving. We can see a lot more of headlines in the Western media on Africa. There are bad stories, but yeah. The first complaint that we were making, it was that Africa was almost totally absent from the Western media. Now we're seeing more stories with a bias. For instance, countries like UK tend to cover more their former colonies. And you may see a lot of stories about South Africa, for instance, or Kenya or Nigeria, because they are much more familiar with that reality. If you go to Paris, you will see the same with the Francophone countries. They tend to cover more about that. If you go to Portugal, we'll see a lot more coverage on Mozambique and Angola and so on. But just to come back to your question, yes, it's true. When Mozambique makes headlines, it's because it has got war, civil war in the past, floods, famine, and diseases. Now, in political terms, as you said, Jeff, there have been a lot of new developments in the last 10 years. Democracy is holding in the country. We're having regular elections. And most importantly, the economy is progressing. And you don't see this kind of stories in most of the media, including in my own country, I might say. Because it's easy to talk about floods, but why are floods happening every year? Something has to be done. It's easy to talk about poverty, but what is being done right now? There are a lot of stories, good initiatives which are being taken in the country to overcome this situation. And this kind of stories you don't see in the media in general.
Good point there, Arlindo. Okay. Okay, Senegal. Sophie, you guys just held an election not too long ago. I don't even think I heard about it.
Well,
I don't even know if people here know who the president of Senegal is.
anybody
Does
knows
anybody
it?
know? No, 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 not you. No, someone else, someone else. Go on. You see?
Anybody?
And
Uh-oh.
it's not ignorance, folks. It's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
ignorance. People just don't know. We don't know.
Are you Gambian or Senegalese? Then you're disqualified. Okay. Good, yeah. That's him. Wad. We say Wad. It's true. And well, fortunately or unfortunately, Senegal goes underreported in Western media, probably because, well, we are a good country trying to develop, and I think we're having good successes. And before I go on, I'd like to say something also. It's, I mean, across the continent, there is an industry which has been developing and really blossoming. It's the media industry. It's developing very nicely. I mean, of course, we have our own challenges. And one good thing is many of the newspapers, the radio stations are online, which gives you more sources of information. So if you would like to cover more of the continent, then you have more and more sources to draw from. So yeah, coming back to the election, yes, February 25, we re-elected very nicely President Wade. Of course, we have our own challenges. Of course, we pretend that at home that it was not that legitimate, etc., but it's just our internal debate because it is a vibrant democracy, because people are in Senegal, citizens' movements are really trying to work out the best political system that really reflect our cultural, political values. But overall, yes, we had a very peaceful election, and nobody heard about it, and everything is now trying to do business with Senegal, well, on the globe.
I guess the point here is when it's nice and it's working and it's quiet and it's not noisy, they don't report it. But the moment someone like Robert Mugabe says something, everybody reacts. Let me throw it to the audience. Good point. You raised your hands up.
Do you think this is more true of Africa than it is of news in general? Because if you look at any newspaper, you know, good news, you don't find a newspaper full of good news about the UK or any other country. Essentially, bad news is what sells newspapers, generally, seems to me.
Okay, let's ask the newspaper man. Azu?
Well, I think to some extent I agree with that. I remember something by Brian Tracy when he talked about an attempt to measure good news published in some American newspapers under Clinton, and he found that at the time when things were going nice and so forth and so on, not many people were interested in the news. And when they measured it against the time when things were not as good as they were previously, a lot of people tended to buy the newspapers more. So really, there is a sense in which we say in the profession that bad news is good news. But what we are trying to say here this evening is that we have to go just beyond what is happening and find out what efforts people are making to make lives better for themselves. And I think that that's very important.
Let me ask you a question. Sorry, I didn't get your name. Tony. So say things turned around in Zimbabwe. Would people stop writing about it?
Well, certainly they would write about the change, and then they would stop writing about it, I suspect.
Would fade into...
Yeah, but I think his point is wonderful because you need a balance. You can't have an entire paper which is only about bad news. And I think it would be great if, as a result of this debate, there begins to be an awareness of the need for good news as well as bad news. So there's always at least, you know, a little bit of room for that to come through.
Sir. And please identify yourselves when you're asking questions.
My name's Ron McCullough. I work with, and we do a lot of work in Africa, mostly with Sarius Samura. There's a terrible political correctness in the coverage of Africa. The truth is we do tell the bad news, but we never go deep enough. I mean, the coverage of the Nigerian elections was hopeless. And the truth is what's happened in Nigeria and the elections in Nigeria is a real blow for democracy in Africa. And the power of Nigeria in that region and the impact and the message it sends out about corruption in elections is a disgrace. And the truth is political correctness and post-colonialist thinking and neo-colonialist guilt means we're not actually properly asking why these things are happening. We're not examining the corruption. We're very good at saying the headlines of bad news. We're very bad at putting it in context and understanding why this stuff is going on. And if we don't do that, if we don't have proper analysis, and mostly that analysis is led by powerful white people who have a guilt about talking about it, we'll never get to the bottom of it. And we won't even encourage... the worst thing we can do is not to criticize Africa as we criticize Europe and Asia and the rest of the world. We have a soft touch in Africa because we're patronizing, and actually it's a version of reverse racism.
Good point, Ron. Okay, Lizeka, you want to say?
I don't know about other parts of Africa, but South Africa is one of the nicer places in Africa to live in for foreign correspondents. My view is that life is so comfortable in South Africa for foreign correspondents that a lot of them, I'm not being personal, a lot of them tend to sort of enjoy the perks of being in South Africa and going and sitting by the Zoo Lake and, you know, reading the papers nicely. And they follow the local journalism, which unfortunately tends to be bad. So what they reproduce is what is bad, what is produced by the South African media, and they tend to take it out. If you look at South Africa, one of the stories that are not undercovered in South Africa is the AIDS story. But as South Africans, we do it so badly that we have reduced something that is killing people in South Africa into an intellectual discussion, you know, with scientists, whatever, and what the president thinks is a virus, what is a syndrome, what is what. And that is what we have made to be the AIDS story in South Africa, which it is not. So the foreign correspondents, unfortunately, that is what they just reproduce, because every day it's like, let's look at the Star, let's look at Business Day, let's look at whatever, and let's file. It's sad.
So what you're saying is they look at what you write and they mirror what you write.
Yes, and I'm saying it's bad what we write. But all of you like very much to go shopping at Woolworths. So you don't want to rock the boat. You want to remain there. So really, that's what you do.
Okay. I'm going to come back to Ron's point. Ron, you made a really valid point. And I saw someone with The Economist. Is that you with The Economist there? You saw the headline about Nigeria. Did you see that? Someone's reading an Economist downstairs, and there was a story about Nigeria. And Azu, we got to talk about those elections. I mean, this was the first, this was like the turning point. This was when Nigeria was going to prove to the rest of the continent they can turn that corner. 8 years of President Obasanjo's rule, he walks away, someone comes in, and they move on, and democracy hopefully will take hold. And it didn't happen.
I agree with you. And the newspaper for which I work, I remember that after the first elections, because the elections were conducted in two phases. Then we had the elections to the state houses of assembly and the governorship elections. And a week after that, the presidential elections followed. Now, I remember that some newspapers wrote editorials after the first elections to say, look, we cannot continue these elections. The elections should be stopped. And the whole process should be reviewed before we continue. But we took a position, we wrote an editorial and took a position that, look, if we stop the process now, it's going to be extremely difficult to move forward after this. Now, one thing that is very clear, which we also did an editorial on before the elections, was that the independent National Electoral Commission was obviously not prepared to do that elections and just rushed in everything at the last minute. And then which was a big shame, and we said that in the editorial, that you had cases of ballot box stuffing and, you know, thumbprinting, and in some areas there were reports of elections before the election day, you know, which is a big shame. It's not something that we are proud of. But look, the point is this, that it was a difficult decision, I believe, for the country, whether to abort the elections midway or to go ahead with it, and then after the elections, to take the case to either the tribunals or the courts, which all parties agree on, have done a fair job up till this point. So even though the elections are over, I'm sure that in the days and weeks and months coming, we will still hear a lot more about what actually happened and then what lessons we can learn moving forward. I was listening to the BBC this morning and listening to the commissioner of the Postal Service talking about what a terrible shame it was what happened 3 years ago during the local elections with the postal vote. And she said, which was what really attracted my attention, that Britain had learned a lot of lessons and will make some amends and move forward from there. That's exactly what we're looking to do.
I'm sorry, you were watching BBC?
Did I say BBC?
Someone had a question.
Or local TV. You provided it for me in my room anyway.
Someone else had a point from the floor? Sir.
Hi, it's just a point on the idea that...
I'm sorry, please identify yourself.
Shoyemi, I'm a Nigerian. Just a point about the idea that bad news sells newspapers. I think bad news in a developed economy is one thing, because the issues and the choices are a lot narrower. I think in Africa, it can do a lot of damage. So on the one hand, you say Africa needs to take its own future in its own hands, but you only talk about the bad news, and therefore people around don't see any reason to actually be positive and try to help, apart from giving aid, and we all know that aid doesn't really work in terms of long-term development. I think it's quite irresponsible for a Western media to say that it's going to take the same principle on Africa, on reporting news on Africa, as it would in England. It's just a completely different scenario, and I think it does a lot of damage, because it doesn't show that things are being done. It doesn't show that actually, if with a bit of help, these countries are actually in a position to start moving forward themselves.
You actually believe that?
I do believe that, yes.
Someone want to respond to that? Yes, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, Damien Lewis, I'm a TV journalist and an author. We could almost turn this debate on its head, because the problem isn't getting good news about Africa into the media. The problem is even getting bad news into the Western media about Africa. It is a nightmare getting anything into the media about Africa.
And the reason is?
Editors say they don't care.
Really?
I mean, I'll give you an example. I've done a lot of work in Sudan, and, it's not a very easy story to get reported on. And we've just been trying to get it's actually a book, published in the UK. It's a Sudanese person's story. And my agent took it to 15 publishers in the UK. Not one of them was interested. Okay, and that's a true story about a Sudanese person who's been through a really tough time. So we can't even get the bad stories aired. So that's where this debate kind of really starts for me. And I don't know about other journalists in the room.
Is that the same? You can't get bad stories on? Sir, in the back, white shirt.
My name's Eamon Gear and I'm a freelance journalist. I have to concur with the last point. I've spent years working out of North Africa, Burundi, Congo and Rwanda, and since the genocide in Rwanda, it's very difficult to get any stories in the press. Mainstream print media in this country have cut back on foreign correspondence. If it doesn't involve Brits, they don't want to run the stories. I mean, I can't think the last time I was able to sell a story about Burundi, and I still keep going back there and write for other sort of more academic journals. But in terms of mainstream press, nobody essentially cares anymore.
Okay, but there's been a rise in online publications. The digital age has come of age, for lack of a better phrase. But and a lot of people are dialing up online to get their daily news. What about the online journalists? Isn't on the online stories about Africa selling? Ma'am, yeah.
Actually, I wanted to make a point about the last two speakers.
Please identify yourself.
Sure. My name is Yvonne Ndege-Burke, and I'm a journalist on a program called BBC Newsnight, which you'll know if you live in the UK. It's a current affairs show. And for the first time in my career, I decided that I wanted to actually go and to do some work in a region. So I went to Africa and the Middle East. And that was my sort of first foray outside of sort of domestic UK news. And one of the things I want to say about the points that the two last speakers made, I have found it incredibly difficult, and I think journalists find it incredibly difficult to get information out of Africa. I mean, I think the missing part of your panel is actually a government communications officer who can actually explain why it's extremely difficult.
They weren't available.
Well, there you go. and I think that's really the challenge, that you know, it's actually very difficult to get good and bad news and statistics and information that you can actually rely on out of almost every African country, in my experience.
All right. I want to bring in Nick Wren here. Nick is managing editor of Europe, Middle East, Africa for CNN. And Nick controls all output coming out of Europe, Middle East, Africa. Nick, do you have a hard time selling African stories?
Actually, no, because I just phone up you and you want to get on the air. I think it depends who your audience is, and you know, there's obviously a difference between somebody who's writing a newspaper for an audience in the UK and somebody who's putting together program rundowns for an genuinely international audience from Australia up to Scandinavia and all parts in between. Our task is to make sure that when we cover a story in Africa, that it's that the right context is added, so that it's appealing for an international audience. And sometimes we have to take a step back to do that. But I'm you know, the last two times I've been to the African Journalist Awards, this exact topic has come up, and it's why does the Western media always paint a bad picture of Africa? And you know, I would argue, one, it doesn't always. I mean, if you look at some of the shows we do, like Inside Africa, it's very lifestyle-y and, you know, very upbeat. But also, at the same time, you know, it would be negligent of journalists if they weren't trying to find out what was happening in Darfur, trying to find out what was happening in elections which go wrong, trying to find out what's happening when governments start killing their own people. And you know, that's our duty. And if we say that we're not going to do that because it was, you know, it would be more bad news for Africa, we're not doing our job.
Good, good. Okay, let me throw a question to the panel here. Folks, is there Africa fatigue? Arlindo?
Well, I don't think so. Well, once again, I would like to think that people tend to be interested in the kind of news that might be interesting to their own audience. I stated earlier that it also has to do with geographical or historical links. I think people tend to look for stories that, well, they might be easier to digest. That's why you always see stories about South Africa, about Zimbabwe in this country, or Nigeria, etc., etc. I think it's not, in my view, a fatigue of African news, because they have never been a lot of stories on Africa in the first place. I think the audience are not tired of reading about Africa. They may be tired of reading the same kind of stories, because that's what you always see. And media tend to copy from each other. You see the same kind of headlines, etc., etc. That's, I think, make people be tired of reading about Africa, but not because they don't want to know more about what is going on in Africa. That's my idea.
Sophie?
Well, I hope not. Africa fatigue. Well, I believe that Africa has not been on the news yet. In my book, I think everything remains to be told. And just reacting to, Nick's comment just now. Of course, we have a responsibility of talking about Darfur and what happens in Darfur, and the politicians' responsibility. But I believe we have an equal responsibility of talking of, for example, these economic issues like the economic partnership agreements, which is, I believe, the next big issue that Africa faces for the next 10 years at least. And right now what happens is, we all know that African countries, Caribbean, Pacific countries, 70, I believe, of them, are negotiating with the European Union, because the European Union wants to impose privileged partnership agreements. And right now, it would be a deadly thing for African countries to sign it because they're not prepared, and the agreements as they are proposed are going just to kill the African economies. They are so weak, and they're trying to get organized. They're trying to get integrated. I mean, there are big challenges, and there are big responsibilities. And the good story is some governments, namely Nigerian government, Senegalese government, right now have taken the initiative of trying to organize West African governments at least to sit on the table and say, hey, okay, we will sign with you, but these are the conditions, give us more time, give us this, give us that. I mean, I don't want to get into the details, but there are important stories. Civil society organizations really at the, I mean, farmers, yes, farmers, and you name them, so many organizations are now getting organized by NGO consortia to make their case and make sure that the governments don't just go and sign under pressure. I hope I'm being clear here. I mean, these are major issues, and Africans are really trying hard. They're getting organized, and they need our attention. They need everybody's attention to make sure that their case is, I mean, gathers attention and strength. Are we covering this? We're not. One last point. Corruption stories are being covered. They should be. But whenever we talk about corruption, big corruption issues in Africa, it also means that there's been big investment, big business, and corruption comes after. Why don't we cover the first topic, which was the business and the investment, and we go straight to the corruption issue? Why? I think we have an equal responsibility, not just a Darfur issue.
Corruption in Africa? No.
Well, yeah, no. Is there?
Lizeka, are you tired of hearing crime stories about South Africa? Because that's a lot of the stories that are done. Does it get a little sickening?
Yes. It's tiring. I mean, crime is a big story. But the problem, I think, mostly from my part of the country, is that while bad news is popular, it's fine, it should be bad news. But I believe a lot of us went into the journalism profession because we wanted to make a difference. And really, when we watch what's happening in Zimbabwe, it really is sad, and we really want to shout about it. But the problem is, why are we not shouting about what's happening in Swaziland, just across the road? People are dying in Swaziland. There's a young man, as far as I'm concerned, he may be old, but he's a young man who's just been given the right to rule over the people of Swaziland and abuses human rights. Is a pedophile, you know, in some instances, but we never hear about it. No one writes about Swaziland. Everyone writes about Zimbabwe, which is right. But the thing is, it gives a lot of oxygen to Robert Mugabe's ideas that the only reason that people write about Zimbabwe is because it affects white people. So that has a resonance in a place like South Africa, for instance. It's like, really, everyone is concerned about Zimbabwe because white people, are affected. Because here are black people in Swaziland just next door. The same things happen to them. Mswati drives fancy cars. Swaziland is poor. People are dying from AIDS. But no one cares. People care because a farmer in Zimbabwe. So even in our, obsession with bad news, it's not fairly, represented. And I think that is a problem.
All right, Martine, Dennis, I'm going to ask you this. I'm going to toss this to you just because I don't want to... Yeah, exactly. Is it true? Is that why Zimbabwe is a quote-unquote sexy story?
I thought Jeff had. I'm Martine Dennis from the BBC. And I feel very much that what we do is we tend to follow a template. Zimbabwe is a story, it was established, I don't know, maybe The Guardian, I don't know. But then we follow a template. Certainly in this country, if a story has been established as something that makes on the foreign pages, then we carry on. We carry on knocking at it. So as you were saying, somebody was saying over there about Sudan, I mean, you can't. You can only get the story in as it fits into the template. And this is us. This is because it suits us. It's easier to deal with. Actually, real original journalism, I think, well, it doesn't happen very often. And when it affects, as you say with Zimbabwe, it's very, very easy just to go onto the line because we know that we're going to get the parliamentarians involved, interested, because half of their estates might be affected. Kenya, you know, similarly. But when it comes to places like Sudan and whatever, then you really have to, either you've got to have very, very sick babies. In fact, we're sick of those, aren't we? So you've got to, and quite frankly, I cannot take any more Darfur pictures. They don't sell, they don't move me, they don't tell a different story. And the real story is political, and we don't get to grips with that. So I'm sorry, but I think it's us, all of us sitting here, we follow like sheep. We're only prepared to do what's already been established, and many of us are not very brave. So I think brave, courageous journalism is really what's needed.
Clearly you didn't see my piece from the Niger Delta, right?
I thought it was fantastic.
You must come back to do a follow-up.
Ron. Maria. It's Ron. No, thank you.
You know, as a former BBC journalist, I have to say that is really, we've really now scraping the bottom of the barrel where we're now blaming our templates for our inability to cover the story. The truth is, if you want to tell stories about Africa, and I hear a lot of people saying, and it's true, it's difficult to sell stories in Africa, but the challenge is there, and our challenge is to do it better. Simple as that. It's a tough story. It's the toughest story, but the job is to make it interesting.
Ron,
and we have to do that. We have to find ways.
How are you able to sell yours? What is your?
Well, it's very simple. First of all, we use. Guess what? We have a foreign correspondent who happens to be foreign. He's African. You know, let's start by talking to the people who actually know the story. Let's stop sending white correspondents in there in the same old template to say, "Oh God, it's terrible." Well, my God, for anybody it's terrible, but actually for a lot of people who live there, they survive. That's a hell of a story. And they find their own coping mechanisms, and that's a story. And the truth is that if you actually listen to people, real journalism in Africa is a hell of a resource. And the idea that, okay, it's difficult to get information out of Africa, well, I mean, it's always difficult. We have terrible problems getting information on a story we're in at the moment on a telephone. But once you're there and you just do the proper job and you spend time and invest in the story, you can find the facts just like you can anywhere else. So what I'm saying is the challenge is to make the important interesting. And I think we also have to recognize that the negative, as I said before, the negative is there. Our job is to understand why these things are happening, not just to go and report that it's bad again. Victimhood that's the big problem. We keep presenting Africa. Somebody came up with a wonderful word. Let's have less of the bog standard reporting. What they meant by bog standard reporting was Bono, Oxfam and Geldorf reporting. You know, let's start looking again at Africa through new eyes, through 21st century eyes. The entrepreneurs, the people who do have great ideas, who are often stamped on by large institutions funded by the West, inefficient and corrupt, who stop the dynamism that's actually down there at grassroots growing up. Where are those stories? They can only be told often by people who are in those countries who know the facts.
But will the audience appreciate that, Ron?
Well, we've made a film out of Africa at least every year for the last 7 years since we've been working with Sorius. And I mean, as you know, a lot of those have gone out in CNN. They've had a massive impact over the whole world. And the reason I think they have is because people like Sorius. They respect him, they engage with him. He's an honest storyteller. He's engaging with the story, and he's attempting to make people understand the circumstances in which, there for the grace of God, go many of us. If we'd been born in Africa, we would be living and trying to cope with the situation that many Africans live with. And you can make that human connection. And if you can make that human connection, what you're doing is the basic business of storytelling. And it doesn't matter whether it's Africa anymore. It's about us, all of us, surviving in interesting and engaging situations.
So the bottom line, I'll get to you in a second, man. The bottom line, is it the Africans telling the African story? And I'd like Edward over here, Edward Boateng. He's Managing Director of Global Media Alliance. Edward, you're the founder of the CNN Multichoice African Journalist of the Year Awards. You had this brainwave, this, like a better word, genius, I guess. You thought of this 12 years ago, Africans telling the African story. What was your thinking?
Well, thank you, Jeff. I think it's important for the African to tell the African story because, as Ron said, you are there, you're from there, you know it. However, one has to be careful. I've met a lot of international journalists across my travels in Africa, and they do tell the African story better sometimes. Just for your information, I'm from Ghana. We just celebrated our 50th independence. The best documentaries that were produced on 50 years of Ghana were not necessarily done by any of our broadcast stations. They were done by the BBC. And Ghanaians were glued and watching. So we have to be very careful with some of these things. I mean, and also, I mean, like, for instance, Ron, for instance, I mean, in Africa, people are very divided about Soros's approach to telling his story. The fact that he's African doesn't mean that people do like those stories. I mean, if you went to Sierra Leone, where he's from, there's serious debate about whether he's really telling the African story because some people find it over-dramatized. So I think we have to be careful. I think what this survey told me was that even those of us in Africa, we're not doing well enough. And I think Lizeka raised the issue earlier. This debate has gone on for years around Africa. And most of the stories that are coming into the Western media, really, they've first been told in Africa. They've been told, and the international correspondents just pick upon them. So my view when I started there was that if we as Africans in the media, as journalists, go out there and do good jobs, the Western media will pick on those stories. And they surely would, because every story that appears in any Western publication, believe me, has been told in Africa before. They do take credit for it, but it's been told. If it's not been told, when they come to Africa, the fixers and the people who lead them are the Africans who tell them this is where to go. I think what we need in Africa now is to be able to build that capacity so that when people come, you can sit down with them and say, this is how this story has to be told. And to be fair, in my examples, whether it's working with Jeff doing the cocoa story on slave kids on those farms, we've been able to say, look, it's not really slavery, but it's a cultural thing, it needs to be changed. And they do listen. I mean, there was a recent story in the New York Times about Ghanaian kids, slaves who work on the boats. The truth is, when that story broke, it had been told in Ghana so many times. But the government never took notice until it appeared in the New York Times. And immediately everybody jumped. But what surprised me, because our company was contacted by the Oprah Winfrey Group to help them do that story, and appeared on Oprah, for those of you who have seen it, was that the amount of work the government had done to stop that particular cultural practice, but it was still going on. But then nobody in Ghana knew that. And I remember the lady, the producer from Oprah, saying that if only all these statistics were available, the New York Times would have used them. You know, why is it that it's not out there? So I think for those of us in Africa too, we have the responsibility and the challenge to make sure that we can tell our story better. And for me, that's why I'm so much committed to this African Journalist Awards, because I believe that if we can train the people, if we can build the capacity locally, it will definitely have an impact on what the international media is covering, because most of the stories they cover have already been covered. It's just that they do a better job because they are better trained and they do have the resources.
Okay, answer real quick for me. But we also have to tell the good, the bad, and the ugly.
I think they do it. I mean, like I said, like for instance, when we had our 50 years, why is it that we as Ghanaians were not able to put together the best documentaries? I mean, you flew into Ghana for a few days and you did some of the best reporting, and everywhere I've gone, people would say, oh, we saw Jeff's reports. Why don't they tell me that they saw our reports, you know, or the reports of our local reporter? So it's also the capacity. And I think it's our responsibility. I mean, it's good that we blame the international journalists. But the truth is, if you look at the statistics on Africa today, most of the good stories on Africa are also covered, BBC came up on top. It was a scientific study done that, the best reports done by the African Media Group or something just before independence, because this same debate took place in Accra. And when they showed the statistics, even CNN that's always criticized, even Jeff came on top. So
You won't come on top in Lagos, I'll show you.
Even in Nigeria,
Okay, there's a lady there behind. Yeah, in the white shirt.
Thanks very much. Sally Ann Wilson from the Commonwealth Broadcasting Association, and for the last 6 years I've been running a scheme in the UK to get better coverage of the wider world to a UK broadcast audience. So I'm not talking about newspapers, I'm talking about radio and primarily television. It's a very complex issue in the UK. It's not just Africa, it is the wider world. In fact, in 2005, there was more coverage of Africa than any other corner of the world outside of the UK. Europe isn't covered very well in the UK in news terms. 2005 was because of it was a political lead with the Commission for Africa and all the issues around that. What we now think is, the domestic news in the UK isn't a whole bundle of laughs either. News, by definition, as I think somebody said earlier, news tends to be bad news. I think it's going to be very hard to change that, apart from the odd little celebrity stories we're getting nowadays. What is interesting in terms of a UK perception and audiences, as broadcasting here has become more and more fragmented, broadcasters retreat into their trenches and get frightened of losing audiences, there is a perception that audiences aren't interested in the wider world. And that's at a time when we're facing globalization, and I think that's wrong. I think audiences are interested in the wider world. It's how we bring those audiences, how we bring the information to them. And increasingly, I think it's the context. If you're sitting in the UK, you get your domestic bad news in a television context of drama, comedy, those sort of programming, which we just don't get from Africa or other parts of the world. So what we're trying to do now is get more drama, comedy, culture, entertainment programming that gives the news a context and actually fulfills the audience understanding that these are all human stories. Back to what Ron said, why some of Soros's programs work so well in the UK is they're stories of real people. And research shows that's what audiences want, is human stories.
And from Africa, if there were human stories, do we not do human stories? Yes,
they do, but the UK, we're talking about perceptions in the UK, as I understand it tonight. And it tends to be issue-based coverage of Africa. Maybe there is a dying baby here, but it's very quick in a very short news piece now. It's an issue. It's not proper contextualized stories other than, there are few programs, Dispatches, Unreported World, Newsnight's coverage sometimes. But it's still taken out of context of everyday life in the UK.
Dan Rifkin in the back there. I'll get to you, Nick, in a second. Dan, you had something to say a while back.
Allow me to make a little pitch, because, a lot of what I'm hearing is that what I took from what Edward was saying in the CNN Awards is there are a lot of good people telling African stories. Are other Africans listening to those stories? Are there people in countries are there people in Nigeria listening to the Ghanaian story? Are there people in South Africa listening to the Ghanaian story? I'm not sure there are. And I think that for, specifically on this topic about the West and the East and the North paying attention to better stories in Africa, Africans need to tell these stories to each other as well. And it's not just good news, it's not just bad news, it's just more stories. If we take the example of newspapers. Well, sure, there are bad stories on the front pages of newspapers, but you go through an entire newspaper, there are all sorts of stories. There are stories about businesses, there are cultural stories, and we're not getting the whole range of stories. And that's what A24, which hopefully will be launching in about a year, which is a Pan-African news channel for Africa, will try to do. And I think once Africans do that amongst Africans, then that will help change the perception in the rest of the world. Because I don't think that maybe Zimbabwe, maybe Darfur, but there aren't a lot of stories of successful elections, We were talking about Mozambique, and there are people who are fighting AIDS, people who are fighting poverty, who have examples to show to other countries, to other people who are confronting the same problems. And I don't think those stories are being told across Africa to each other yet. And I think that once Africans are doing that better, that will help change the perception in the rest of the world.
Dan, sounds like you're recruiting there, huh?
I am, by the way.
Nick, you had a point to make. And then I'll go to you, sir.
As a very quick point, one of the things that we haven't touched on is sport. And for a lot of people in Europe, their touch point with Africa is through sports stars. And in those men and women, I think we have a lot of positive stories to tell, both on this side and in Africa as well.
Okay, is it just those guys who are just going to be the links? Is it the Didier Drogbas or the Michael Essiens? Is that the only way we can tie the European continent to Africa? Is that the link? Or are there other ways?
I think as Africa starts to embrace more big international sporting events, and I sincerely hope the World Cup will be a huge success and that other big sporting events will follow in Africa. I'm sure they will. You know, that will be a big lift and a big coming together, you know, in the way that many people get their news and relate to stories.
Over there, thank you.
Hi, Anthony McCall. I'm from Scribe Strategies. Sorry, yes, okay. May I make a plea that we all remember the Mauritanian elections a month or two ago. They got a lot of coverage because it was a very good story and it was very unusual from a country which has a diabolical track record, really. I mean, it was a genuinely big story and it did get covered, really. Maybe not in the red tops, but in most of the serious media it did. So I think when something really different happens, we are awake enough to actually write about it. That was just in passing. My point was going to be, if you stand back and think about what proportion of the world's countries are in Africa, it's very roughly a third of the world's population or something, or countries anyway.
887 million people.
Well, yeah, I was meaning the countries.
Oh, 54.
Yeah, and there's very few
Anything else?
There's very few parts, I'll leave it at that. There's very few parts of the world which have had such a consistently bad press in the last 50 years. One of the reasons is the terrible mess that was made of actually creating countries there in the scramble for Africa. That's a cliche, but it's obviously true. And it has a huge impact on how the countries feel about themselves, who they are, where we're going, and the struggles and the tensions in them. Some countries have been lucky. Senegal might be one. And there are others you can think of, Botswana. There are others where they're not so bad. But places like Nigeria are close to a joke in terms of their identity. It's a bit like asking Germany, France, and England to become one country and be big buddies and start getting on together. I mean, the whole thing would implode, rather like Nigeria does, and will do for quite some time, probably. And I think we all know that there is a huge and inspiring grassroots example of what the ordinary people in Africa are like, and there's probably lots of good stories to come from there. Their problem is their rulers. And apart from the euphoria in the post-colonial days, that's all long since gone. And it's a byword that it's been pretty well a kleptocracy until about 10 years ago. I think we mustn't try and dodge those issues. It's been spectacularly the case, and more visibly so, perhaps, than any other part of the world we can think of. It doesn't help the general press, do you know what I'm saying? And luckily, possibly with the advent of the African Union and the fact that we're all growing up a bit, including in Africa, things are starting to change.
So you're saying Africans are their own worst enemy? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not. That's a little simplistic. I'm glad you're trying to summarize. What I'm saying is, if you could, we all say this when we have a drink afterwards, if you could get the politicians out of the way, Africa might just sort itself out and be freed. I'm sorry it's such a cliche, but somebody ought to say that, really. And I think the day is dawning when that is starting to happen. Mauritania might be one example. There are others as well. But a lot of them are basket cases, and they don't help. Bad at information, bad at running themselves, dishonest, mainly there to fill their own pockets. And I know this subject tolerably well. But they are going. They are going. They're the dinosaurs, and I think we should take some heart from that. When they do go, things do change.
Thank you very much. Sir, go.
Don't want to say too much. I've been in Nigeria, Ghana for the last 15 years as a reporter. African leaders don't drop from the skies. I disagree with my good friend here. They are from the people. They don't fall one day and, oh, there's another one, you know. They are derived from the people, and that's not the really, I don't think that's the answer. But we're not here to discuss that. But in terms of the story is, presumably, and we've heard one or two people talk about the politics being the root of it. After all, the issue, presumably, is the failure of the post-colonial settlement and the failure of governments and their leaders to deliver. So the dismantling of the post-colonial settlement, i.e. the destruction of Ghana, Nigeria, Congo, and all these unsustainable sovereignties, you know, probably with the exception of Senegal and Botswana and so on and so forth. That's the story, isn't it? But everybody's afraid to cover it because they're all members of a club which everybody's a member of. We can't, it's taboo. That's the taboo. Anyway, that's it.
Senegal's getting a lot of kudos tonight, huh? Sir, in the corner there.
Hi, my name is Sam. I'm not from media, so forgive my lack of knowledge around the subject, but it seems like to me that since we're entering the dawning of the age of Aquarius, and the power of knowledge and the power of information is supposedly shifting to the consumer rather to the institutions that provide them, maybe we as the media institution, if I can join you guys for a second, should shift and look down instead of up and look at the people and give them the tools to choose the stories that they want. I was having a discussion with my wife on the way over here about microfinance, and you know, the stuff that we know about microfinance is this big, but the potential for stories around that was huge. And I don't remember a lot of places where I could link through that catalyst story, the Nobel Prize, through to a lot of information about microfinance or a lot of positive stories. Right? And I couldn't link through Madonna's adoption to a lot of positive stories. Maybe there's a good reason for that, but there's a lot of catalysts out there that would provide people, I think, individual consumers of information, to find their way to good stories. Maybe it's a good movie. Maybe it's one of the, movies at Cannes that gets pushed out. And if traditional media maybe turned around and gave the people the choices, and obviously it would have to be more of an internet thing initially, because that's where the change in those templates comes from. That's where the news story breaks, is when the people demand it. And maybe if we figured out ways to link those things together and get some excitement about it, and maybe not even have people know that the story's coming from Africa. Maybe it's like some kid on his computer somewhere, doing something new, and, it happens to be that it's not Japan. It could be somewhere in Africa. Anyways, I could go on for days about examples, but I think, we should kind of disintermediate the news maybe and get it down to the people and let them decide what it should be.
All right, as the mic is making its way to the back, you raise a really good point. Madonna, right? Great story. I mean, everybody covered this story. Everybody was there, right? Why not take the opportunity, because I saw so many journalists from the UK and the US there, why not take the opportunity while there, piggyback on some more stories about Malawi? But did anyone care? Soon as Madonna left, they all left. Sir.
Hi, my name's Paul Curry, and just quickly, I think one of the reasons why nobody went on to other stories is because the sort of correspondents that were following Madonna are not the sort of correspondents that then go on to do social and political coverage. But that's just an observation. Well, sorry, man. I just wanted to throw back to the panel, actually, a point you raised earlier, Jeff, about the online world, the internet. I have some opinions on the way that information technology is changing and will change journalism, but I don't work in the media, I work on the technology side. But I was interested to hear from the panel, as journalists coming from more traditional media forms, what you see the potential of the information revolution, particularly the internet, obviously, but also things like mobile phones, what you see as being the potential to transform media coverage both within African countries, but also Africa's ability to communicate, African journalists' ability to communicate with countries and an audience outside Africa.
Lizeka? All right, Azu, you had the question.
Right. It's happening slowly, but it's happening surely. I mean, in Nigeria, for example, The Punch, which is the newspaper that I work for, we not only have Punch on the web. We have e-Punch. That means that if you log onto our site, you can read the newspaper from page to page as it is. So that is happening. And of course, we have a situation, I said earlier, that the communication industry is growing quite rapidly. And so we have pages in our newspaper that interact with citizens or audience and encourage them to file in their own stories as they want them written. So that opportunity is growing, and I think it will only get better as the years go by. Thank you.
Sophie, before we go to you, did you know that BlackBerry works in Nigeria? Did you know that? BlackBerry works in Nigeria. Why are you surprised? All right. Sophie?
Actually, in Senegal, the opportunity is clear already. Okay, is this better? For one good, simple reason, it's the diaspora is important, and they're following the news at home. They're very interested. More and more of them are voting because our democracy is vibrant, has been developing, and most of this, Senegalese in many countries outside are able to vote, so they follow the stories. And most of the newspapers are trying to be online. Am I answering your question? Was that the question? Yeah. Yes? Okay. So yeah, in Senegal, it's the opportunity is there. And exclusively online media already, some of them already exist. And the diaspora...
About Mozambique.
Sorry, and the diaspora is very influential. And our President Wad, is very sensitive to what the diaspora says, thinks, feels, and and most of the newspapers would have these forums and these votes online and stuff. So it's developing. Sorry.
Well, the situation in Mozambique is quite the same as in Senegal or Nigeria, for that matter. So there's really a very good opportunity of using the new media to enable people to get more information in Mozambique itself and outside the country. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, when we started having independent media, we started with the fact sheets, or new media, I don't know how to call it. It's called actually the first independent media, news media in Mozambique was a daily called Media Facts. So we're using facts to transmit news, to provide information to a lot of people in Mozambique, and it was quite successful. So using technology, to provide more information to people. And now with the cell phones, with the internet, we're also having more and more information about Mozambique online. If I can talk about the region, we also have other resources in the region. I don't know whether you heard about the Southern African Research and Documentation Center. It has a lot of information which might be useful for those who are looking for information about Africa, and it's available online. So definitely the new technologies are a very good opportunity for us to communicate better with the rest of the world.
Caroline, you had a point. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Caroline. I work for Multichoice in Africa.
And what is Multichoice, Caroline?
We're a Pan-African broadcaster, pay television. And I want to go back to the point that Sophie made earlier, because I think it's a hell of an important point, and I think it is the story that should be coming out of Africa. And that is, what about the large companies investing in Africa? We don't hear anything about their kind of responsibility in terms of doing business in Africa and the way they do business in Africa. And it's only recently that you've seen programs like and films like Blood Diamonds, that you're seeing what actually goes on the ground for industries that drive the European and the UK market and the American markets. And I think there's a big story there that hasn't been told, and it's the root of the corruption.
Okay, Tony, yeah. Good point, Cap. Good point.
I just want to pick up on something that's been said in sort of half-ways various times this evening, which is really making a plea for the power of cinema to bring Africa to the world. And I think your mentioning of Blood Diamond is important, because I think in recent years we're finally seeing more feature films that are about Africa. You talked earlier about the importance of telling stories, and I think that's how you get to people. Most people will generally not feel very enticed by what they perceive to be dry news or something that's painful or awful to read. But they will be enticed into the cinema, even if those stories are painful at times. If they're moved and if they're engaged with the human story behind it, that's how you're actually going to build film as an ambassador. And I think that message isn't really, I mean, with so many problems of starvation and AIDS and everything else, it's very hard for governments to understand that actually supporting a few films would make a tremendous difference to people's perception of their country. So I think, you know, here's a plea for more support for cinema in order to reach people.
Sorry. Lizeka, you have a point to make.
Thank you. I've been wanting to make my point for ages and ages and ages. Because I wanted to respond to what the gentleman was saying over there, what the gentleman was saying over there, to what you said, and to what... And really, it's very important what organizations like Multichoice, for instance, are doing in Africa. Quickly, the World Cup will be a success, and there's no plan B, there's no plan C, there's no other plan. It's coming to South Africa. Get over it. The people who doubt it, you know, who keep hoping it will go to Australia, it won't.
I'm not one of them. Get me a ticket.
It won't happen. But anyway, one of the, you know, the threads, you know, that keep going around, other people are interested in French-speaking or Portuguese-speaking or whatever. But the one thing that really brought us all together, I think, was done by Multichoice. And it was Big Brother Africa. It was a fabulous success because it was the very first time, especially for just Africans to see each other as people, not the political, not the poverty, not the famine, none of the boring stuff. It was just, it kept us riveted. I mean, we watched TV, if we could, 24 hours a day, because suddenly we were confronted with a Nigerian, a Zambian, an Angolan, and they were ordinary people. And it was the most successful thing in terms of, I think, viewership, wasn't it, Caroline? I don't know about the advertising support. I don't think it was there because it was Africa again. But in terms of, you know, good television and the interest, it was there. So the ordinary people and their stories are missing, and it was the first opportunity, and we really, really latched on to it. It was fabulous. It was the best ever. So I don't care if I never hear about Darfur. I want Big Brother Africa to come back.
So what you're saying is reality TV and art imitating life is what's going to draw an audience closer to Africa? Like Last King of Scotland, Big Brother Africa?
The point about this is that it just portrayed us as normal people, you know, normal people, not the people that Charlene Hunter-Gold calls, you know, like the disease, the death, and the despair, and what's the fourth D? There are 4 Ds there. But yes, it was suddenly Africans were normal people. And if you're talking about using, you know, new technologies, we were all like linked on, we all logged on to the Multichoice thing, and I was in my, you know, the club that supported Tapua from Zimbabwe. I mean, we talked every day. I knew the supporters from Nigeria, because we talked every day online, and we all were determined to keep tabs there.
I dare you to name all 7 members of Big Brother Africa.
You don't want me to because I will.
Yes.
Hi, Elsa Pringle. I don't come from a journalistic background, so I'm coming from a consumer of news here. I'm South African, based here in London, so a lot of the information I get from back home in Africa and South Africa is through online. I find a lot of the newspaper sites I go to, I literally skim over the headlines, and it's the same sort of crime, someone's been killed, someone's been shot, what's going on. I actually find going to blog sites or actually trying to find online, and there's some really, really good stuff out there by people who have got no journalistic background, no sort of training, etc., and they're getting some really nice stuff about Africa out there in a completely different way. I think my point is that the online gives a lot of Africans the opportunity to get their stories out without having to have the brick wall put in front of them of that you haven't had the training, you haven't got the education, etc. It gives them a voice, and I think there's just so much positive stuff to be found in those kind of things, and online is something that can be really taken advantage of by a lot of people in Africa.
Is blogging the future? Is that what we're looking at, folks? I've been watching the French elections. There's a lot of bloggers. Is that where we're going? In the back there. What does that do for the rest of us real journalists?
Blogging's all well and good, but surely literacy rates in Africa and access to the internet, are essential before the majority of people have any chance of seeing the news. That's why radio journalism in Africa is still so strong.
Yep.
I agree with the point about literacy, but I think what we're going to see in the future is much more convergence. I think everyone in here has got a phone with a camera on. And mobile phone networks are, well, okay, let's say 90% of the people with a mobile phone. And with the rate of uptake of, for instance, cell phone networks in Africa, it's not out of the question for people to be actually posting reportage from their mobile phones onto blog sites. It's not actually that difficult to do. I can't do it. I'm a technophobe. But I think one of the things is that people tend to use technology in ways that we can't generally imagine. The way that people use technology is not generally how it's predicted. And I wonder if that's one of the things that we're going to see coming out of places like Africa, where people do have less access to the mainstream media, where they will start to use that technology in ways that we haven't really thought of yet. And watch the news on their phones. Exactly right.
You don't even have to go that far. A couple of weeks ago during that Virginia Tech shooting, the first images, the guy with the cell phone, right? We watched that for like 12 hours. There were no other images. It was this guy with a shaky phone going ba-boom, 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 ba-boom. Right, remember? U.S. You're right. You have a point. Ma'am, in the back.
Hi, I'm Robin Hunter, and I work for the Africa page of BBC News Online. Every 10 people that read our website on their mobile phones, 6 of those are Nigerians in Nigeria. I traveled around northern Uganda. I got the news from people I was met along the way by looking at their mobile phones. I really believe that that's what will change Africa.
Azu, did you know that?
Well, no, I'm not surprised. I said earlier when I was making my comment that in The Punch, which is the newspaper where I work for, in fact, the amount of letters to the editor that we get is by people who are sending letters to us. It's less than about 10% of what we publish. We publish most of the letters sent to us by email or text messages. And also during the last elections, one of the reasons why things did not turn out as disastrously as some people may have wished for was the basic fact that you have people standing at different polling booths and saying to one another, just using their mobile phone and say, look, I voted at this polling booth, and these were the figures announced. What were the figures announced over there? So, there is a sense in which if we as journalists fail to tell the story with the kind of context which we ought to tell it, ordinary people will seize the momentum and tell the story by themselves.
Ron, you had a point?
Name dropping here, but Sorius and I were consultants on Blood Diamond, and it was a very important film because of the issues obviously it brought to people who otherwise would not be interested in Africa. And indeed, there's a lot of that going on. There's a word that I like to use for it. It's called consumerism, a mixture of consumerism and humanitarianism. And I think a movement forward in terms of African journalism and indeed development world journalism is giving the tools to the consumer to find out where their products are coming from. And that will link people back into the real world. Because the biggest story of Africa is not what's going on inside it. Actually, the real truth is follow the money. Where are the resources going? Who's getting the resources? How are those resources being acquired? What deals are being done? That's the big story. And people's interest in the products that they buy and where they came from will lead us right to that door.
Oh, Edward, you had a point, yeah. You had a point. Sorry, Marina, I got you running all over this place.
It's exercise.
My question is to Jeff. I just wanted to understand what we're trying to achieve out of this discussion, whether it's about getting more African coverage in the Western media, that's in the UK or European media, or it's just the hard improving coverage across board in Africa. I mean, because it looks like we're talking about so many issues, and I just, I like focus. So I just wanted to understand.
Look, it's good to talk about issues. We're not going to solve this underreporting issue, which is a topic tonight. We're not going to solve this today. People have, other things to do and other stories to cover. But we just want to highlight the fact that there are stories out there that need to be covered. There's stories being covered locally, but they need that extra push, which obviously is not getting there. There's some blanket, there's some barrier. How can we get them reported over there? Good, bad, and ugly.
But also, just to make one point on somebody raised a question earlier about the impact of the internet. I think it's growing. But one technology that's having a huge impact in terms of news dissemination and how news is reproduced in Africa is the mobile phone. And I think that has a bigger impact than the internet that's over here, because texting is one big part of African news distribution now. And I guess, like, if you listen to radio in Ghana or Nigeria, people just texting. And from here, if you really want to get a mass distribution, really now it's more the mobile phone more than sometimes even television.
Sophia.
Well, Edward, I think there is a focus. At least I wanted to hear the focus, so I heard it. At least I heard two strong focuses. One is, I think the lady over there talked about the need for us to go back to courageous journalism. And we may want to call it social responsibility, because quite frankly, sometimes I have the feeling that we journalists have given up on the ambition of producing information that will transform political systems, social realities. I mean, look, Europe has, journalism has helped shape Europe 50 years ago. Information journalism is going to help shape the kind of Africa that we want to build. And it's across the board. It's journalists in Africa, African journalists, European journalists, American, all over. So it's our social responsibility, all of us, to really go back to the issue of courage. And, it has to do with unions, it has to do with working with editors, it has to, to rethink the whole system. It's not an easy thing. But the social responsibility, that's one. And second, you talked about it, Edward, it's capacity building. And again, it's across the board. Of course, back in Africa, the need to build the capacity, the basic capacity in many cases, is blatant. But it's also here. Because if say British journalists are going to cover African stories, they need to know more about Africa. They need to know that Africa has a history, has a culture, has a political history, has had political systems before the political system that we know today. And then if they're going to be analytical, they need to know more and maybe do more than just the surface reporting that we get too often. So yes, there is a focus to this discussion. Social responsibility and building the capacity across the board. We all need to make sure that the young journalists, when they get out of journalism school, they go spend some time in Africa, just as our young journalists go spend some time in Canada just to have a better sense of the world.
Edward, you're listening. Lady in the back, and then I'll come to you. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Inês. I'm a student from the London School of Economics, so as well not a journalist. I was wondering, we're talking about the good news and the bad news, the horror stories and the success stories, but what about the stories that are actually not told or don't make the headlines as often? And a lot of it has to do with environmental degradation and the natural resource depletion that's actually happening in Africa. And you see every other day a big story on climate change and global warming, and you see a lot of coverage on what the developed countries are doing. And having said that, they are contributing to the most of CO2 emissions, but in terms of the rates of population in Africa that are growing so at unprecedented rates, and water scarcity is a huge issue. And those perhaps have long-term implications and therefore aren't covered in the media, or at least mainstream media as much. And I was wondering if the panel had anything to comment on that, if they consider that that might be a story that should require more coverage and a little bit more attention, especially in this era of climate change and global warming and green millennium that we're living in now.
All right, good point. Arlindo, I saw you nodding your head.
Yes, I entirely agree with you. I think there's exactly some of the topics that we don't see much covered in our news media, especially not just international media, but also in Africa. When I mentioned previously that it's not enough to talk about poverty, about economic problems in general. We have to find out what causes this kind of problems. And we are now actually with this climate change and global change heading towards more problems in Africa. We're seeing forests being destroyed. There's actually water scarcity that might cause not just famine and starvation, but even wars amongst countries in Africa. So these kind of issues, I think we should be watched carefully and covered. So I totally agree that those are the kind of problems that we should be looking into. Some of the uncovered and underreported topics. But just let me say before I pass on to other people, that if someone asked me, what do you want to see about Africa? In the first place, I would like to see Africa more reported in the news. That's the first thing. There are lack of information about Africa in general, in the first place. Secondly, actually, I would like to see more quality in terms of coverage. These kind of issues like the ones we just mentioned, climate change, etc., economic development, NEPAD. Anyone has heard about NEPAD here? What are we doing in Southern Africa in terms to overcome, in Africa actually, to overcome our economic problems, etc., etc. There little has been published regarding NEPAD, etc. And so I think first is the quantity. We should see at least Africa in the news. It's very important. Someone once said, well, I don't care whether you talk bad or good things about myself. What I want to hear is that you talk about me. At least say that I'm alive. Africa exists and it counts for humanity. That's for me the first important thing.
Yeah. Lady.
Just to pick up on something I've been lucky enough to witness, which is a good news story, and a good news story about African media. As Commonwealth Broadcasting Association and as a producer myself for years working in Africa, it's been rare to see African programme makers and broadcasters working together. But in 2005, the African Broadcast Media Partnership Against HIV doesn't sound very positive, but the ABMP was formed. And I've been to a number of meetings which has seen Nigerian creatives, Nigerian broadcasters sit down with South African broadcasters, South African creatives and producers. I think there's now, Arlindo, you probably know, there's about 47 members of the ABMP. What's come out of this very negative thing, HIV/AIDS, is something incredibly creative where African journalists, producers have sat down together and decided not just to follow Western media models, but to actually start creating, using, what's the most fundamental thing for me about Africa is storytelling, but using modern technology, modern media, to work through ways of actually telling stories initially rooted in AIDS, but I suspect using that opportunity to build partnerships and see how well that capacity building and people working together can be. And I think, I don't know how well that's been covered in the West. I know certainly one of the initiatives was to have a minute's silence in Africa throughout the continent. I'm not sure whether Multichoice and the BBC actually joined in that minute's silence. I'd like to see them do that next year, because that's very much an African media initiative, and I think we should all be looking to support that and report that in the West.
When was this minute silence?
On World AIDS Day. And I certainly think all African broadcasters themselves did observe that minute silence. I know that CNN, BBC were asked if they might consider doing that. They said they would report it as a story, but not actually observe the silence.
May I just add to what Anne has said, that it wasn't just a minute of silence. All broadcasters who are part of this partnership played the same message at the same time. It wasn't just a minute of silence. It was agreed that all broadcasters, who are now over 40 in Southern Africa, in Africa actually, played the same message at the same time. So that's the initiative she was talking about.
All right. Sir, over there. Party Marina, second row.
Hi. My name's Sam, and I'm from the Movement Art Foundation. In case anyone's wondering what that means, basically we use movement to tell stories, and we work with displaced young people at the moment in London, and we're hoping to eventually work with an organization called Right to Play, which is an African charity which uses play to educate young people and sport, basically. And my point is about sport and the importance of it. I think that one of the things that we probably all do is fail to do a joined-up thinking thing, because sports and culture are very much linked. And in terms of connecting grassroots in the UK, ordinary people with Africans, I've found that one of the most important ways to do that is to engage them in more experiential learning, because you can't teach anyone anything just by talking to them. So one of the things that we do is that we use, for example, a sport like Capoeira, which is embedded in African culture, to actually, and people who do that do find themselves literally transformed. And if you look at any other sort of movement art or any other martial art across the country, across the world, things like, when people think about China, they think about Kung Fu. When people think about India, they think about yoga. That's how they understand. And they actually participate. And in actually participating like that, they gain a deeper understanding. And if you could actually kind of convey this more through the media, I mean, it's great having all the increased communication tools, but if you can actually use them to actually help people to access these kinds of stories, I think that would make a massive difference to perceptions.
Excellent, Sam. Thank you very much. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all so much for coming. First of all, thank my panel, Arlindo, Sophie, Lizeka, and Azu. Thank you so much. It was a really good discussion, and I think we made some really valid points. And it's going to be tough, folks. It's been tough. It's been half a century. Like Edward was saying, Ghana just celebrated 50 years of independence. And it probably came and went, and a lot of people didn't pay attention. It'll take a while, but we're getting there. There's a new generation of African leaders. Gentleman there said the first generation is on its way out, just about gone, the big men of Africa, as they were well known. But there's a new generation of more educated, more learned, more worldly, and the world is getting a lot smaller. So we will get there eventually, but we can't do it alone. We'll need a lot of help along the way, and the help comes from everywhere. We'll take what we can get. On that note, I'd like you all to give yourselves a round of applause before we all leave.
Thank you, Jeff.